All right, hello again, everyone. I am still Jim Ryan and still the Dean of the Harvard Ed School. And it is my great pleasure to welcome and to introduce our speaker, Mark Yudof. Here at the Ed School, we spend a fair bit of time talking about education leadership and the mindset and skills needed to navigate among competing demands and different constituencies, all the while keeping student learning and opportunity front and center. It's a delicate and difficult task, and Mark Yudof has lived it for most of his professional life. He has served in numerous leadership capacities and indeed is one of the most widely known and well-respected leaders in education today. He began as dean in his leadership capacity at the University of Texas in Austin, then became provost at the University of Texas in Austin, and then chancellor of the University of Texas system. From there, he moved on to become the president of the University of Minnesota, and most recently, the president of the University of California. And this was, this was a fairly minor task. It involved just a mere 10 campuses, 230,000 students, 19,000 faculty, 190,000 staff, 1.6 million living alums, 5 medical centers, 3 national affiliated laboratories, and 1 statewide agricultural and natural resource program. He was an extraordinary leader, and his tenure was remarkable for at least 2 reasons. The first is, and I think this will be one of his enduring legacies, he increased access and affordability for thousands of students in California. He spearheaded a program to make tuition free for students whose families earned less than $80,000 a year. He spearheaded and launched what has been so far a very successful campaign with a goal of $1 billion to devote to financial aid, and he increased financial aid not only for the poorest students but also for middle-income students who weren't able to and aren't able to access much in terms of state and federal financial aid. He did this, and this is the second reason why his tenure was so remarkable, under some of the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He had terrible timing in terms of taking over the presidency of the University of California in 2008. The state was nearly bankrupt. There was talk of slashing funding to higher ed by 10%, and he faced a budget gap of roughly $1 billion. Not a situation that many of us would walk into lightly. His response was to make some tough and at times controversial decisions, including asking faculty and staff to take unpaid furloughs and raising tuition. He also decided to take on some persistent and complicated issues, like the financial crisis looming in the state pension system and restoring an equitable distribution of state funds to individual campuses, issues that he saw as crucial to the future of higher education in California. Despite these obstacles, or perhaps because he met so many of them, his accomplishments caught the attention of the national media. And in 2009, he was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 best college presidents. When he announced his resignation in January of 2013, Mark told the LA Times that the best advice he had for his successor was that, quote, "You need to be like bamboo. You need to bend, but you can't break." I think these words characterize his approach to leadership, and I bet that Janet Napolitano, who is his successor, is trying to follow those words of advice. These days, Mark is relaxing a bit as a professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley, returning to his roots as a leading authority on constitutional law, freedom of expression, and education law. And if I can end on a personal note, I have to say it is a genuine thrill for me to welcome Mark here, both in my capacity as former law professor and current dean of HGSE. When I began as a law professor over 15 years ago, I knew that I wanted to work in the field of law and education, and it was a field that was not very well populated at the time. There were very few people working in the field. One exception was Mark Yudof. And I read everything he wrote, including a case book that I was later fortunate enough to join. But I read his articles on desegregation, on school finance, and I was struck not only by the analytical clarity, the brilliant insights, but also the amazing writing, which if you've read a lot of law journals, you realize is an exception rather than a rule. He is a very lively writer filled with wry observations and lines that are quotable, and I have quoted his lines ever since, including one that I probably quote at least once a week with respect to school finance litigation. For those of you who don't know, school finance litigation often goes on and on and on. And Mark once observed that school finance litigation is like a Russian novel. It's long, tedious, and everybody dies in the end. And what I realized after a few years of being a law professor is that you don't need a lot of role models if you pick the right ones, and I feel like I picked the right one. And this is actually, even though I feel like I've been intellectually stalking him my entire professional life, this is the first occasion we've ever had to meet in person, so it's a real thrill. It's also a thrill as Dean of the Ed School because this may be a little-known fact, Mark actually began his academic career here in 1970 and 71. He was a lecturer at the Ed School while he was also working at the Harvard Center on Law and Education. So his talk tonight is college costs, or higher education rather, the cost disease and systemic reform. Please join me in welcoming President Emeritus Mark Yudof.
Thank you. This is a momentous occasion. Our book appeared a number of years ago, but yet this is the first time we met, which is a good indicator of how much work I did on the book. And I should tell you that I'm down from 190,000 employees to only a half of an employee, hence I'm late, and I apologize today. And I'm glad that Vice President Katie Lapp was here. I lied to your president when she called me. Because I didn't want to lose Katie. I was convinced I would go to jail if Katie left the University of California. It did not happen. There was an uptick in the economy. I think that helped. But she is a tremendous asset for Harvard or for any university lucky enough to have her. And it is true, I was here during contentious times. I was a lecturer. And in the spring semester of, I guess it was 1970 or 71, there was the bombing of Laos during the Vietnam War, and classes were suspended. It's the only time in more than 40 years in higher education I did not have to grade examination papers. So even the most catastrophic event can have a small silver lining. I never forgot that experience. Jim already used, I was going to tell you my speech is like a Russian novel, but I won't take you through that again. I thought I'd say something about my adventures as a university president, chancellor, and provost over the last 20 years, most recently at the University of California. One thing you have to understand is that I have worked with, I wouldn't say four, with 6 governors. And I want you to listen to my governors: George W. Bush, Arnie Carlson, Jesse Ventura, Rick Perry, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Jerry Brown. So I have the best gubernatorial experience of any college president in America. I mean, they defy description. And of course, all of them wanted to be president of the United States, but of course, one was born in Austria, and I met him in his smoking tent at the Capitol. That was very interesting. I'm planning to do an as yet unwritten tell-all book, which I hope you'll all buy at an exorbitant price. I've had many memorable moments in my administrative career. I'll just mention a few of them. I blew up a parking garage yelling "fire in the hole." No casualties. I released, on purpose, I blew it up, yes. I released a rejuvenated eagle from the top of a building, and you can imagine how I felt. Is this eagle going to do this, or is it going to do this? The eagle flew. I felt very good about that. I drove a steamroller and a farm tractor without maiming anyone. That was a miracle. I held a small human brain in my hand at the Minnesota State Fair. I assumed the brain of some long-gone university administrator. And later indulged in eating mashed potatoes on a stick. Sloppy. I also had a radio show, and at one point, this is a longer story, I ill-advisedly came out in favor of arranged marriages. sort of jokingly, but I had my reasons. And around the same time, I was invited to appear on Fox Cable Network to defend an allegedly pro-pedophilia book published by the University of Minnesota Press. I was invited to take the pro-pedophilia position on Fox, and I declined the honor. My spouse and I mostly lived in university housing. We have endured fire and flood in that regard. 2 cars caught fire in front of our house. 1 exploded. Katie may remember that. The ATF was out, the FBI and all. They said it was spontaneous. The neighbors never believed it. Protesters built a teepee adjacent to our house in Minneapolis. To their disappointment, I told them that I sort of liked their teepee. It was better than most of the houses in the area. At the University of California, which has its own mores and norms, I was imprisoned 3 times, falsely imprisoned 3 times by protesters in UC buildings, and I had been energetically chased across tennis courts, hotel lobbies, and agricultural fields. And one group even put a likeness of me on billboards at the Oakland airport to protest my position on labor contract negotiations. So, bottom line for the students in the audience is if you really want an exciting career, perhaps more dangerous, say, than the FBI, then I advise you to pursue a higher level university post. And Jim, I understand you've experienced a little bit of that. What I want to do today is address many of the challenges confronting higher education in the 21st century. Many of my observations underline the rule that good judgment often comes from past bad judgment, and I've had plenty of that. And my remarks will be brief. As my spouse always says, Mark, you're not only dull yourself, but you bring out dullness in other people. Actually, it was Johnson who said that, but the major problem confronting higher education today has been called by some prominent economists as the cost disease. Higher education is labor intensive. People tend to associate quality with smaller classes and more face time with professors. And even public universities aspire to achieve the intimacy and the student-faculty ratio of distinguished private universities like Harvard and Stanford. And if those universities are also a research university, the university's expense is also exacerbated. It's something people don't talk about very much, but the ability to discover knowledge as well as to disseminate it is a fairly rare skill in any country, and there's a premium for such people. And in addition to that, there are various things you need to do in terms of blocks of time for research and sometimes technologies and labs and so forth that render it more expensive. And what's important to note is that not all the stakeholders are necessarily on the same team. Nicholas Lehman used to be dean, I guess, at the communications school at Columbia, said there are 2 non-congruent ideals of higher education. With only few exceptions, most stakeholders who provide resources to universities, parents, students, alumni, donors, legislatures, businesses, foundations, believe they are paying for skills-conferring, teacher-centric institutions. And most of the senior leaders of universities believe that the institution's core mission is research. I mean, that's just true. There are 2 different languages which are going on simultaneously. With these 2 labor-intensive missions combined with service, the cost of higher education rises over time. There are restraints on competition within the sector through commitments to access, government regulation, and other things. And the overwhelming majority of people cannot afford to go offshore for the services. It's thus very hard to reduce cost and render higher education more efficient. And if that sounds like another problem that you probably confront in your lives, it's very similar to medical care, right? I mean, the cost goes up, the technology's not paid off, people associate more time with the doc or whatever as being a better experience qualitatively, and most people, there are rich people who do it, but most people get their medical care in proximity to where they live and where they work. Now, if you want to, and just bear with me, this is the way lawyers think, if you want a deeper understanding of the cost disease, think about a symphony orchestra that wants to reduce the cost of putting on a concert of Mozart's Clarinet Concerto. I say that because it's my favorite piece and one of the last pieces he wrote. I knew he'd never amount to anything. The orchestra manager, of necessity, Katie, a bean counter, informs the maestro and musicians that it is imperative to reduce cost. Perhaps the performing arts subsidy from the state and local government has gone down. Perhaps the wages and health insurance costs have gone up, as they seem inevitably to do. She would like to increase the ticket prices, but there's great fear of an adverse public reaction. She also fears that if you raise the ticket prices to the concerts, low and middle income people, their attendance would be jeopardized. They simply could not afford to be there in many cases. She offers a number of proposed solutions. One solution is to reduce the size of the orchestra. Who the hell needs so many horns and violins? Hire less talented and experienced musicians. Pay the musicians and the staff less. Fire the marketing and development staff. Refrain from long-term contracts with musicians and fill out the orchestra on-the-spot labor market. Sort of drive into Harvard Square, see who's available. Play in a larger venue. Or my favorite, videotape the concert so a larger audience can enjoy the concert on multiple dates. The orchestra members, of course, are shocked. They see a cacophonous future for this orchestra. Individually and through their labor representatives, they press for higher wages to offset real price increases at the grocery store, in durable goods, housing, and health care. But the harsh truth is that it's extremely difficult to offset higher wages with savings in terms of efficiency. Symphony orchestras don't work that way. What is a more efficient production of a concerto or a symphony? It is not like producing more powerful computers on an assembly line with the same level of labor inputs. And the musicians threaten to look for jobs in industries where wages rise in proportion to productivity. And what I would say about this is culture is the other big example of the cost disease. Culture, education, and medicine. But if you think about the modern debates over medicine and higher education and the range of political palliatives that have been offered, it's quite obvious that the cost disease is part of the problems and the difficulty of creating efficiencies around increases in wages. And if you think I exaggerate, the New York Times has had a number of stories that, in fact, symphony orchestras are reducing their size in many parts of the country, and they pay musicians by the concert and the rehearsal, and they play less frequently. So it really is a major, major problem. What is different today, I would argue, is that there appears to be less tolerance of the cost disease in higher education than in past decades. It is true that the states currently spend about $81 billion in higher education, but 48 states, according to the data I have, fund higher education at a lower level than they did 5 years ago, roughly at the start of the Great Recession. 48. The only outliers are, Alaska and North Dakota. I don't know how many of you want appointments in Alaska and North Dakota, but not I. On an inflation-adjusted basis, the University of California received more money per student in 2007, 2008, and so it goes. The most affluent universities have fared better, but they're few in number and educate a relatively small proportion of university students. The average tuition at four-year private institutions is about $30,000. I understand your tuition is just a tad higher here. They only serve those private universities about 16% of the students. I think about 20% are in private institutions, and only 16% of the students in highly endowed private universities receive Pell Grants. The last figure I have for Harvard, and I know you've been working on this issue, is 11% is the last I've seen. It may be higher now. So the less, and then I would add to that, the less affluent private universities really do have their problem. I mean, their demand for their services is not inelastic. They cannot raise their prices forever. They do not have large endowments and the like. In 1970, the government contribution to public universities was 60% of the cost. tuition was 15%. I won't go into all the numbers, but we're on the verge of reversing that. And at the University of California, more than half the cost is paid for the students. And maybe 25 years ago, it probably was 80% was paid for. And there is some evidence that the students have become more price sensitive, although it's somewhat mixed. That is, things like job prospects, convenience, academic reputation all mean a lot. But this trend is unmistakable. And I think an article today in one of the trades, they called it the Great Retreat, something like that. And all I can say is, there's one wag put it, Rome was not sacked in a day. And I think we're seeing the sacking of higher education in America across decades, maybe accelerated in recent years. Now, I have to say, I do like the past. I'm glad someone's reading my articles, Jim. I like the end of daylight saving time. You get to set the clock back an hour. That's pretty cool. Out of loyalty to memory, I still carry a comb. Now, why is that? Why is state funding not keeping up? What happened to yesterday? Why is it that efforts to re-educate legislators so often seem to fail? Why do some miscreant entrepreneurs advise young people not to go to college at all? Why is it that attempts to put constructive accountability measures in place seem to be on steroids in some jurisdiction? What explains the present predicament? Now, what lawyers do is we theorize without much data, so I will definitely do that today. One of the reasons is demographic. Today, only 46% of American families have children under the age of 18. In the heyday of the baby boomers, it was closer to 60%. You have an aging population. And Peter Schrag, a very brilliant journalist in California, wrote a book, and in that, it was called Paradise Lost. I wonder where he found that. He said that in most elections in California, the big exception being the 08, maybe the 12, I'm not sure, Obama presidential election, in most elections, the majority of all who participate at the polls do not have school-age kids, either elementary and secondary or college. So you have a shift in the population. And I'm telling you what you already know, but if you have an aging population, the shine is a little bit off of higher education. Their preference goes to healthcare, Social Security, and locking up the bad guys. I mean, look at the expansion of prison budgets in America over the last 25 years. It's quite extraordinary. There's one study that shows that senior citizens now receive more than 7 times the federal benefits that children receive. And we have a lot of poor children in this country. And we have poor senior citizens too, but there are affluent elements among the seasoned citizens. And the truth is that the children and young adults who need our support in higher education today are increasingly Hispanic and poor. And there's a tendency to eschew responsibility for the education of other people's children. And that is just plain wrong. It's myopic, but it is the reality. When you look at preferences in terms of how legislatures respond and how people vote within the school districts and within the state. Another thing which I think is very important, and I won't give you all the statistics, but I think there is a decline in the sense of commonwealth or common purpose across America. Declining support of public goods and eroding privatization. Now, most goods are, this is not an economist argument, and most goods are hybrid. I'm not making a pure public good type of argument. But, the understanding was that most of the money for higher ed would come from the state, and that the students and their families would make a contribution. But that sense of higher education being good for the polity, for the nation, for health care, for democratic participation, and so forth, I think that is largely eroding, and a lot of voters just don't see those benefits. And unfortunately, this is not limited to education, and I'll just give you a few examples. All the toll roads being built in America, once quite rare, are now quite common across the country. Gated communities. Take police protection. Did you know that there are about 1 million private police officers in this country? Work for universities, they work for corporations or whomever. There are 900,000 sworn law enforcement officers working for the government. So there are more private police officers in this country than there are police officers working for local governments and state governments and so forth. If you want to observe the architectural wonders of the new industries in the Silicon Valley, and you want to go out and see the beautiful facilities at Oracle, and you want to see Microsoft and Apple and so forth, you drive along the potholes of the 101. I mean, there are two Californias. There's one California in the public sector, and then there's this affluent private sector. And they have not only their own cafeterias and all that, their own buses. To the extent possible, they try to insulate themselves from the general run of public services in California. The infrastructure, we had, as you know, we had deaths in 2007, a Minneapolis bridge collapse. There are still 65,000 unsafe bridges in America. The total infrastructure deficit is $3.6 trillion. Government just doesn't want to fund it. I mean, it's a loss of public purposes. If it's not gated and it's not a toll road and you're not paying to go across the bridge, oftentimes it just doesn't get done. Public research funding as a percentage of GNP has declined by 60% over the last 40 years, a very important statistic. We now spend more in America on potato chips than on research. Potato chips are good, but still. And the other area, and I won't go into my normal tirade, although I could be encouraged, is the use of essentially mercenaries to fight wars abroad. If you compare World War II, you compare the Korean War with Iraq and Afghanistan, by geometric factor, they are being, and of course you had the end of the draft, but they're being fought by what amount to private soldiers. And you know, you can have your views on that, but that is true. In my judgment, a lot of this privatization has gone too far. I like FedEx, but it's still gone too far. I think another reason for the eroding support for higher education is that there have been such productivity improvements and labor reductions in many, many industries across America. And I think that's it's almost a public relations problem we have. When you are confronting people, if you are asking people for donations to the graduate school, they're going to say, I had to change my business. I downsized the number of employees. I did this, I did that. I redid the pension plans, a whole series of things. And the argument is, we changed, you should change. In other words, there's a parallel. They don't take into account the cost disease. It's people being, they normatively do not accept the cost disease diagnosis. If you say we have this issue of how we deliver education services, the answer is you're being stubborn, you don't want your cheese moved, or whatever the phrasing is, but you're not really different. It's just the professors like it that way, or the administrators like it that way, and that's the reason they're being non-responsive. So the problem here is that many elements of the public, and certainly political leaders, will not give higher education a pass. You can argue till the cows come home, they will not do it. So as former Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings once said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And as Mark Yudof said, I don't know where I said it, but I'm saying it now, the lower the appropriation from the legislature, the more control it seeks. They're in an inverse relationship. It works better than Moore's Law. For all these reasons, I don't believe higher education will return to the halcyon days of yesteryear, when institutions were rarely held accountable, when state governments and donors wrote checks trusting the dollars would be well spent. They say, "Here, Dean Ryan, here's $1 million. Do whatever you think is best." I hope it happens to you, Jim, but that's tough to arrange in this world. The budgeting at that time was faith-based. You had faith that it would all come out in the end. If not, you went to Katie and said, "Can I have a loan?" And then the next year you came back and said, "I don't want to repay it." And so there are real challenges to higher education leadership. Now, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on how you might meet the challenges. Some of this you may disagree with. Speaking of things that are faith-based. In higher education, it is faith-based that you need to have a lower student-faculty ratio. Just look, every time a new public university president comes in, what's the first thing he or she says? They say, oh my God, we're at 28-1, we should be at 22-1. If we're at 22-1, we should be at 18-1. And the faculty, I think for good reasons, is very supportive of that. And but it's almost knee-jerk and without much thought and without regard to what's happening on the ground. The student-faculty ratio, perhaps not at Harvard, but in public universities and many privates, is slipping almost everywhere. The student-faculty ratio is going up. And the legislatures, in the public case of the public universities, show no sign of wanting to fund the New Jerusalem. They're really just not buying into it. They will not do it. And furthermore, what's happening, regardless of how boards of regents vote, is you have a systematic replacement of tenured faculty with research leaves and other things that are very important, with often quite good lecturers and others that don't have tenure, with heavier teaching loads and less research money and the like. But that is a way of lowering cost. And it provides, by the way, some of the mobility in a system which is built on tenure. If you have too many people in the vacuum tube department, you can hire some lecturers who know something about transistors and computer chips and things like that. But academia is very undisciplined about this, very undisciplined. It's just assumed that the lower faculty ratio is automatically good. I sometimes say that academia is very disciplined in examining other people's disciplines, but not very disciplined in assessing its own pedagogical work. There the faith base comes back in. So I have a fantasy that some president and some faculty senate somewhere in America, maybe in Guam, I don't know, issues this statement. It says, in order to balance our budget, live within our means, and provide a quality education to students, we must learn to live with a 30-1 student-faculty ratio, and we're studying the best way to deploy our limited faculty resources to do that. Some classes can be quite large with minimal loss of learning and quality. Some can be offered wholly or partially online. Others should be taught only in small class or seminar settings. In the coming years, in consultation with the students, we're going to figure out how to do this. I've yet to see that statement issued anywhere in America. Now, it would require immense cooperation, collaboration, and so forth. And the internal politics of a university can be gruesome. And Jim, you may want to take this down. I'm often asked how a university differs from the private sector. My answer, in business, it's dog-eat-dog world. In academia, it's just the opposite. But one can dream, and those dreams include other sacred cows. What's so sacred about 4 years? Why not 3? Why does every student need to choose a major? Why not a broad sampling of courses? The universities could still require some sampling in different areas. Why so many incrustations of prerequisites and credit hours for majors? And then the wall of separation between online learning and on-campus traditional education, I think, is likely to come down in the next decade. The MOOCs have gotten a bad start. I have to admit, I was not a fan. Maybe I'm still not. I figure, give me $20 million, I enroll 100,000 students in a course, there's no examination, no one knows whether you're really online, and 5% of the students complete it. To me, that is not a successful educational experiment. But having said that, I think eventually students and faculty will deliver the type of education that they think is most appropriate, and over time, that will happen. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 or 15 years from now, a quarter of all the courses were offered online or partially online. I think you're also going to see more emphasis on certificates and updated skills. I heard a dean of a very prestigious business school recently say that the MBA may be fading into some obscurity over time, that there would be certificates in international finance or accounting or management operations or whatever, and that may well be the case. I'm also very keen on, although it's in a very early stage, competency-based learning. I mean, the truth is, there are people in this audience who can learn introductory Spanish in 6 weeks. And the truth is, in 28 weeks, I'm still going to be marginal. And there's no reason that seat time should be almost a complete substitute for achievement. I mean, I understand there are exams and all the rest of that. And there are experiments. Lumina Foundation now has a group of 18 universities in a network. I think we ought to look serious to that. Now, this drives, the people who enroll students and the registrar's office crazy. What if, in an introductory course, some take the exam after 2 weeks and others take it in the following semester. I mean, there are logistical issues and I think real issues for the professor in terms of how you teach those courses. But I think we ought to look at that. What are the competencies? I wanted to say a little bit about that. A lot of times what I see is a sort of commodification of knowledge. Rote memorization, dates, what are thought to be marketable skills. You learn to fix an air conditioner that no longer exists in the market. It obviously should be about cognitive skills, about problem solving, synthesizing ideas, communication, learning to learn. And I always add to this, sure you do need to know something, mathematics or engineering or literature or science. I certainly hope my surgeon, whatever his or her cognitive skills, knows a little bit of anatomy. But I think the main thing to get out of an education here or any other great university is that development of the cognitive learning. That's the main thing, not the specific bodies of information. And I think it stood me in good stead. I was an undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, and I took Greek thought, I took comparative religion. I remember taking the wrong half of the history of music course. I listened to Gregorian chants till I was blue in the face. I was so happy when polyphony was invented. I couldn't figure out what took them the hell so long to invent it. And astronomy. And I'm also pretty good, I think for other reasons, remembering my abnormal psychology course. So I think that we're going to need to focus on the public concerns. We live in a time of significant unemployment and underemployment. Many have left the job market. The percentage of the population working outside the home seems to decline by the year. In a controversial area, socioeconomic mobility rates, and maybe you have better data, they seem to be about the same over as in previous decades, although the size of the wealth gap has grown substantially. But the actual socioeconomic mobility rates are about the same. But it is just true that too few of the poor matriculate or graduate from college, despite even fulsome financial aid, and despite having the same performance grades and scores or whatever else counts in the admission process. Another big problem in terms of in these terms is only less than 40% of our population has a 2 or 4 year degree. And people are always telling me, I know someone with a PhD driving a taxi cab, but that's just not the smart money. It just isn't. And we know that you have lower unemployment rates with college degrees. And according to the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, you make about $800,000 more on average over your career. And the reason, by the way, the gap has been growing, this is very interesting and may not sit well with you. It's not so much that the value of a college degree has gone up, so much as the value of a high school degree has gone down. That's what the recent Pew data shows. And there's about a $20,000 a year average difference. So when I look at that, and I look at the average cost, tuition and living expenses at a public university of $18,390 for a full-time student, and I said just a tad higher at Harvard, I'm just not in agreement with those entrepreneurs and those people that get on the cable channels and all that and say, what a fraud. Why would you do that? And I just would challenge, I would like to see some of those entrepreneurs call their daughter or their son or speak at the dining room table and say, Johnny, Mary, why don't you just skip college? Who knows? Something good may happen. You might inherit a lot of money from me. And despite all that, and despite the hysteria, I don't think America believes that, by the way. Look at your applications at Harvard. UCLA, which is the most popular public university in America by applications, had 86,000 applications for, 5,000 positions in the entering class. They even denied me admission, and I didn't apply. But there's an underlying set of problems. The aggregate debt is about $1 trillion. The tuition has gone up 262% over the last 40 years in real dollar terms. Family income has barely moved in the last 20 years. And according to Janet Yellen, the average income for the lower 95% of households rose only by 10% over the last roughly 25 years. So it's not a pretty picture. So the perception is that the middle class is very hard pressed, but as the reality is always more complicated than the grand narrative in the media. One of my favorite sayings is Oscar Wilde, who once said, "The pure and simple truth is rarely pure and never simple." The net tuition which students pay has not gone up nearly as much as the sticker price. And that's begun. The New York Times discovered that 6 months ago. Higher education discovered it in 1894. And so you see more about that. I saw a study that actually, Jim, you mentioned the Blue and Gold Scholarship Program, that actually warned me some. After the Blue and Gold program, we did raise tuition 70%, but tuition actually went down for low and many middle-income families. Not just tuition, the overall cost. I don't mean to say just tuition. And it's redistributive, but if you're not getting your money from the state, I think it's like an airline. You're going to sell the seats at different prices, and hopefully, in our case, given the nature of the good, we want to give it away to a lot of people who are deserving and can't afford it, but other people who can't afford it, we need to charge them more. The talking heads on various cable channels think they have found the villains, roughly in order of priority: rock climbing walls, administrative overhead, and faculty salaries. The truth is that the reason tuition is going up so much is because the state subsidy is going down so much. If you want an analogy, it's like you have health insurance, and you go to the drugstore and you say, "I want these pills," and the pharmacist says, "Well, last week it was $10, this week it's $20, the copay." It doesn't mean the price of the drug has gone up. It means the insurance company doesn't want to pay. And that is what is going on with respect to higher education. And in rather startling numbers that you never see, and this I think is important, in real dollar terms, in 1987, 2012 real dollar terms, 1987, total per pupil spending in public higher education was $11,085 per student, $11,085. And in 2012, that's 27 years later, it's $11,095. It has gone up $10 in all those years in real dollar expenditure terms. It all depends on what you mean by cost. If you mean the cost to the students, the families, it's going way up. And that has happened for a variety of reasons. It's happened because the copay has gone up. It has happened because there is so much wealth transfer. The average public university, probably 20-30% of tuition gets reinvested into scholarship money. The University of California is a little bit higher. At private universities, it averages 45%, but there are many distinguished universities, quite distinguished, where there's a return of 45 or 50 or 55% of the total tuition to financial aid. So I don't think $1 trillion is chump change in debt. But when I look at it with some perspective, and the average debt is under $30,000, the poster child is always someone who's borrowed $300,000, who's getting 4 PhDs and went through an expensive medical school. But if you look at it, it's not as bad. But the problem is perception is extremely important. And it's exacerbated by other things. Graduation rates from a place like Harvard tend to be very high. Nationally, the graduation rates are an abomination, particularly at public universities. You may, at many good universities, have a 40% four-year graduation rate, 45%. Six-year graduation rate is barely over 60%. So that's a major, major problem. And so what to do about it? I'm just about out of time here. I think you ignore the middle class at their peril. They have the votes. You can't just say you haven't thought it through and quote Oscar Wilde. It doesn't help. They vote, they're unhappy, and the politicians listen to them. And so I think that, and by the way, their net worth is amazing. 50% of families have a net worth of $11,000. The United States has a lower net worth than Greece. Think about that. And 1/3 that of France. I mean, it's not a very encouraging situation for the middle class. I think we need some radical restructuring. I think a family that has a firefighter and a teacher, 2 career partners married, that they have a heck of a time affording higher education. So my own view is, and I think the president has moved in this direction, although I would move even more so, perhaps he would if he had the votes to do it. I probably would say that no one pays tuition who makes under $250,000 a year, just to pick a high number, could be some other number. But then you have something like a Social Security tax that you pay it back later on. And if you engage in certain forms of public service, or you have hardship, or whatever, the government can modulate it so that, and that way you would take that out of it. Now there are a lot of issues. I know the faculty would get on me on this. I mean, the question of how you know what people are earning, the question of how you control what might be skyrocketing tuition once you separate the payer from the system. And how you encourage the states to maintain their effort. These are all very important topics. Penultimate topic is research. I won't say very much about that. At universities, again, the investment is much lower. I would say that, to me, the most short-sighted part of current policy is that there's this tree called a great university. And then there are these beautiful ornaments that are hung from the tree called wonderful research projects. But you talk to any director, center, or dean, or whatever, the tree is sagging. The ornaments are luminous. The tree is not luminous. And they seem to think that you can mount these programs without having the talented faculty and graduate students and having the courses and all the rest of that. I think that's a pipe dream. And I think that eventually you have to include some additional infrastructure support, and not just the buildings. I mean the human infrastructure support in order to really fund research. In closing, what I'd like to invoke is the words of President Eisenhower. I don't read about presidents after about 1955. I was very fond of the Roosevelts. And he delivered an address near the end of his second term, and many of you may have read it. This speech is renowned for its warnings about the dangers of the military-industrial complex. But he said a lot more. Eisenhower touted the role of research universities. He warned that in times of crisis, there is always the temptation to embrace spectacular and costly action. Like Aristotle before him, he preferred moderation and balance. And what he said was, we must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources for tomorrow. And I think we have been plundering for decades, is my view. Thank you very much. Jim, I don't know what I don't mean to hold people up. I think oh, okay. I think I said everything I know. But okay. Sure, happy to do it. Try to answer.
You covered a lot of ground. But there's another aspect to this that I wonder about. Who's going to do the socially necessary labor? It used to be in the Eisenhower era that manual labor was considered dignified and paid a decent wage, and people didn't feel compelled to go to college just to raise their income, people that didn't deserve or didn't even want to be there in the first place. So at the same time that we're creating a better environment in college for people who really want to be there and can take advantage of genuine resources that are there, people shouldn't have to feel compelled to go there because their standard of living is so declined or because the status or lack of status acquainted with doing necessary and dignified manual labor has been so eroded either, should they?
I agree with you 100%. And in fact, if you look at the college-high school gap, it begins to take hold really in the late 70s as the information age is just beginning to blossom. I think it's a great tragedy. I mean, the truth is you could get a good job on a manufacturing line, or you could be, my dad was an electrician. He made it not great, but a decent living his whole life. And it's dignified and it's worthwhile, and I agree with you. But the manufacturing, a lot of those jobs are going abroad now. And then you have you just have a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you require a college degree for every sort of job, well, and there are more applicants than there are for the job than there are jobs, that's the result you're going to get. I think it totally exacerbates the problem, what you've described. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So if it turned out that half of the content of our technical subjects was really garbage complexity, and we could clean it all out and double the efficiency of learning, would there be a constituency that would be interested, and where might they be found?
Well, I think there'd be a constituency that would be interesting, but I don't know how you do that. We have, well, Jim and I in our book, we have such trouble with what's called the education production function, sort of tracing inputs and defining them and then process variables and outputs and who would agree. What's the output? Is it a job? Is it time in college? Is it income? I mean, it's quite difficult, but I think the politicians would gravitate toward it. I mean, at least that's what they say. But I'm not quite sure how you do. I made some suggestions, but I'm not sure how you would really do that.
Students everywhere are taught how to arrange pieces of information. It's fairly obvious that the educators who show them how to do that are unfamiliar with pieces of information that are designed to be easily arranged.
Well,
there's lots of opportunity.
I don't know. That could be. And you may see that I'm on both sides of this issue. That's probably so. And on the other hand, I just fear this cheapening of the coin of the realm, that we'll end up with garbage if we're not very careful. There's no real consensus, by the way. This is very interesting. It's a little like healthcare. There's no real consensus that higher education is not working well. It's that it's too expensive. And maybe there's not enough opportunity and it doesn't take care of poor kids the way it should. I mean, these are distributive questions and efficiency questions. But despite some Herculean efforts, a frontal assault on just flat out not working, I mean, that doesn't seem to be going anywhere in this country or most other countries. So, yes, ma'am.
Hi, Juana Hernandez. I'm an MPP candidate and a UCLA alumni. I really appreciate your point that often the young adults that need our help are Hispanic and they are poor. But to that, I know that most of our Latino students are enrolling in minority-serving institutions, so HSIs. These institutions often lack equity in funding allocations, and they also suffer from much lower graduation rates. In that context, how do we respond to really federal government's call that we increase transparency and we graduate more students in order to remain eligible for funding?
Well, I'm not against transparency, and I say that even though I was a dean. And so it's fine. And I'm actually for President Obama's more transparency, although I think there's some very tricky questions about how you normalize the data and who the students are and what counts as success. And I mean, there's some hard issues. But we're not going to get through this with transparency. We just need to do a better job for these Latino children. And I mean, I know it's trite, but I mean, it's the public schools and to some extent the community colleges and higher education. There's plenty of blame to go around, but I don't. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I'm okay that when you pay for aluminum siding, you get 3 days cooling off period, or that, God forbid, you settle on a house and you have 28 documents telling you what your interest rate is, and all the rest of that. I just sign because I know they won't close if I don't sign. But I don't think disclosure and transparency is going to help all these children. We need substantive programs, and we're not very good in this country, in my opinion, at educating poor kids. And we have glorious examples of successes. But when you're the experts, but when we scale up and all the rest of that, this is a tough road, and we're not nearly where we should. And there are resource differences, and I mean, we could go through all that. There's a lot of these schools are racially and ethnically impacted. We could talk about that. I think there's been some movement, but it's slow and it's difficult and it's not near enough. But what I'm fearful of is the privatization movement coincides with this, what I'll call the other people's children problem. And that's really what worries me a lot. I mean, it's just the way I feel about it. So, yes, sir.
Jack Wolf and I come from the dreaded business side, sort of we change, you need to change. I do a little bit of work in higher education these days, and one of the things we see are the opportunities for flipped classrooms, blended classrooms, MOOCs, and doing things that are in a much more sophisticated fashion. Yet the rate of faculty adoption is abysmally slow in that. What can be done to help to change that and change the quality and the cost and the access to higher ed? Well,
I mean, I don't have a good solution for you, but I will say this. You are not going to coerce or regulate the faculty into do this. You need incentives, and you need champions on the faculty, and you need quality output, whether it's online learning and MOOCs or whatever. And it's not going to come top down. So, I mean, I'm not sure it was one of my more successful efforts. I put I can't remember, $5 or $7 million or something in a sort of grants competition among the faculty. Not coercing anyone, but said, here's a pile of money. If you think you can put your course online, we will help you do that, give you time to work on it, pay for people who know how to gussy it up so that it online, so that it's appealing to students and so forth. I just think that, the mistake is being trying to be overly directive with the faculty. You need faculty champions, and you need to facilitate. You can't really coerce. I think it'll happen. I always think of my Commodore computer. I bought it like 25 years ago. I brought it home, couldn't figure out what the hell we'll do with it. And I really wasn't interested in some game that looked like Pong or little round things eating each other. And I thought, this is really dreadful. This is never going to work, personal computers. Who do this? And, and now I'm sitting on the train here, and I'm conducting my business from a little tiny cell phone. So, we're all impatient, but I don't know that we're going to outrun. I mean, it's very hard. I mean, think of it. There was Commodore, and there was Wang, and there were Xerox computers. None of them are here anymore because the technology and the business plans and all that sort of outran the early competitors. And I think it's a little like that in higher education. There are some efforts here, on the online at Harvard. It's had some quite noticeable successes, but it's not mainstream. It's not mainstream in the sense that it's widely adopted. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you than that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Michael Getz. I'm a higher education master's student here, and I was just reading a paper for one of my courses this term with Professor Light. It was written by Dan Weiss from Haverford, and he was saying that part of the problem is that the folks on the inside, the leaders of colleges and those of us who dwell in these places and work in them and study them, who understand the complexities that you described, don't effectively communicate them out to politicians and the public. And I'd be interested, since you were a leader in public higher education, to know, do you agree or disagree, and what did you try with that interesting array of governors and legislatures on that very front?
Well, I think there's something to it. I remember at Minnesota, I got my first presentation on the capital plan, And I looked at it and they said, we're going to change out the air changing systems and the electricity isn't flowing the way it should and we need to point the bricks. And I said, we're not doing any of that. We're going to be in the historic preservation business. And we're going to be in the program business. People don't care about the building, but they do care what goes on inside the buildings. There's a famous book called Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel, which makes that point. So I do think we often are very klutzy and we use insider information. Every time I saw an acronym, I would fall out of my chair because I'm the guy that has to present it to some legislative committee and they don't understand it. Having said that, I did explain it and explain it and explain it to these guys, mostly guys, not all guys, right? And they have their own compass, right? And what's going to get them reelected? When's the last time you saw anyone defeated on their higher education position? Quite the opposite. If you're governor, apparently, of Pennsylvania, Texas, North Carolina, to some extent Florida, they ran against higher education. And so there's always someone that says if you're only a more effective communicator, and in life that's always true, there's always room for improvement, but I have this tinge of skepticism. There are mega forces out there. There are demographic forces, there are economic forces, and there are, the question of how we treat our Latino children. There are all sorts of major, major things, and it's not just that your president or your provost failed to bring tears to the eyes of the chair of the House Education Committee.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Charlie Viola. I graduated from the master's program here in higher education, and I work at Harvard now in the registrar's office. I was wondering if you could speak to the role of competition among higher education institutions in terms of their reputation with one another and that type of spending versus their institutional goal of serving the public, and how we could try to realign our resources so instead of competing with one another, but rather going back to our mission.
I'm not sure I understand all the dimensions of your question. I'll give it a shot and correct. I think there is a problem of competition. Because, it just seems to be a truism. Every community college wants to offer 4-year degrees, and every 4-year institution wants to be a university, and then they want professional schools. And, I was in Texas. I think every county wanted a new engineering college, and there were 254 of them. And I said, there isn't enough money in the world to do, apart from who would teach at them and who would take the degree. So I do think there is a problem, and sometimes there's a zero-sum game among public universities in the legislature. And by the way, sometimes between publics and privates, because there are a number of states where you can, there are private scholarship money, and there's always a backlash where someone is saying, why are we putting any money? Well, who cares, and I'll use California, whether USC or Stanford students get a proportion of this money. Let's put it in the public universities. I think we could use something like the master plan in California, which is fraying a bit, but nonetheless, basically it said, the top, I'm trying to remember, what was the case? The top 12.5% of students would go to the University of California, the top third would go to Cal State, and the top 100% could go to the community college. And if nothing else, it did cut off a lot of hopeless expenditures on graduate programs. Now, I said there's been a little erosion in some professional areas, and now there's an experiment where some community colleges in California can offer 4-year degrees. I have mixed emotions. I'm not a Puritan about this, and we're not getting the job done in terms of educating people. So it's not the end of the world to me if a community college can do a good job. That's the key to it. So I do think there is some unhealthy competition. I don't know that it would fundamentally change very much, but there's an awful lot of money that is wasted because, to me it's like something like, Division I football. Okay, but not everyone should do that. It's very costly and takes a lot of your resources. And everyone thinks they can just establish a medical school in some small town in Arkansas or Texas or Georgia, and all of a sudden things will bloom, and the investment is enormous. And the chances are, for a variety of systemic reasons, it never really will succeed. It's not going to be Johns Hopkins, at least very unlikely. So.
Hi, My name's Chris. I went to a community college and then went to Berkeley, so I really appreciate the master plan. It helped me out a lot. And kind of going with that, in California, with the public education system, it's such a big public good. But you talked a lot about the contraction of funding and even this sense of wanting to support public works in the United States in general. Do you think that with universities, large public universities, they're going to start turning more inward and doing what's best for them and not thinking as much about the public or moving away from that to the extent that they've been in the past?
I think it could well happen. That's a good point. I didn't discuss that in my paper. I mean, what do you do when you can't balance the budget? So one thing you can do is effectively diminish the size of the faculty or cut salaries, maybe not here, but the next person to hold the job. That's not good. I have to tell you the truth. When I was looking at our $1 billion budget, $3 billion to $2 billion within a year and a half or 2 years, I said, what's our set aside for financial aid? And I was told a third of every tuition dollar was set aside. I thought about it. I mean, I was trying to juggle different things. It's like a great sailing ship. You have a crew, you have sails, you have a keel and so forth. And I was trying to figure out what to do. I think over time that could well happen. What has happened mostly is an increase in the student-faculty ratio and a substitution of lower-cost faculty for higher-cost faculty. But it's perfectly conceivable that they would want to admit more students who could pay their own way. We've seen that in private universities. And it's perfectly conceivable that they would reduce the internal financial aid. I think I can't remember, there were a number of states that have actually done that in the last couple of years. You would probably know better than I.
Yeah, I remember I was there in 2008 to 2010. And, they're upping the out-of-state students, international students.
Yeah, that's another phenomenon. That's causing great angst in California. It's, some campuses is up to 20%. Historically, it was 5 or 6%. And that's, if I were ruler of the universe, I would not allow public universities to charge non-resident tuition. Then we'd even the whole playing field. I once made that legal argument, but they scoffed at me.
Thank you very much for your analysis of the cost of higher ed. I was just wondering if you could comment on the possibility, at least, that institutions could do a lot more to reduce cost. And there are some examples out there of nonprofits. I'm thinking of the Southern New Hampshires or Western Governors of the world that are delivering what some say is a pretty high-quality education at an extremely low annual cost. Is it possible that the organizational models of universities are outdated with respect to controlling cost?
I'll say it isn't so. I think so. I sit on the Illumina board, and I chair their educational policy committee. So we got the Southern New Hampshire people to come down and do presentations. They're actually, I thought, quite clever. And it had analytic content. Again, I was afraid we're memorizing, when was the 13th Amendment passed or something like that. But no, it had a high analytic content. And so I don't know, that was sort of the second half of my presentation. I guess the main point is, unless you deal with the student-faculty ratio issue, you can't really reduce the cost. Now, you may have too many administrators, You may want to furlough Katie, although I wouldn't recommend it. You'll be in trouble. I think you have to grapple with the core issue, of how can we, if we want highly talented professors, how do we meet their needs and also the needs of the students and not be trying to drive it down to 11 to 1 or 12 to 1 or like many private universities. That's my opinion. You can I've been at universities, currently at Berkeley. Berkeley's an interesting experiment, a great university with unbelievably bureaucratized. So I now empty my own trash. I don't collect trash very often, right? I have the key to my neighbor's office because they decided only one thermostat for every other office. So I knock on the door, open his office, put it where I want, go back to my office. All that stuff can save you money. I'm not saying it's unimportant. You can buy your equipment together and you can have shared services and not allow every school to have its own, computer systems and so forth and so on. I think it's all worthwhile, but the core problem is the labor-intensive nature and the difficulty of associating, increases in compensation with increases in productivity of the whole outfit. I mean, there are other things. If you reduce it in time to degree, that would increase the throughput. It wouldn't really reduce the cost per student, but you could argue that you could educate more students that way. I think, I'm hoping you'll come up with something. I mean, I think we need some creativity here to deal with it, because we're not coping with it very well. And in universities, when you cut a budget, the typical response is you don't return it to shareholders. You don't have shareholders. All you do is reallocate it to someone else. So you say we saved some money because we're washing the windows once a year. I had people write me, because I did it twice a year at Minnesota, and said I never knew I had a view of downtown. And yeah, you save some money. But typically, I didn't say, okay, we're going to refund tuition checks, or a portion of them. I gave them to the academic departments where I thought it would do some good. And that was my instinct. So anyhow.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your time. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming, and thanks for your patience.